Hello and welcome back to this episode of Rant. I'm your host once again. And how many times in history has mankind tried to play God? You know, it never fails. Every few decades or a couple of centuries, there's someone that comes along who thinks that the world would be better under their control and that society should just turn it over to them. No questions asked, no consequences considered. You will eat the bugs and you'll have nothing and be happy. Or at least that's what they tell us. Though the motives are not always the same, it always ends in catastrophe, and rightly so. The earliest recorded in history would be the Tower of Babel. Nimrod apparently forgot the whole purpose of the flood that happened very shortly before this next event was due to man's wickedness and self-promotion to a god status. It wasn't necessarily the fact that those who built it were trying to literally reach heaven, but that they were already placing themselves in a position of self-worship and importance as a god, since back in those times, and I guess similar to today, we make statues and we name buildings and build monuments to man's accomplishments and their legacy, essentially creating an immortal image of that person. You know, a few more examples of modern history would be that of Hitler, Stalin, and for my generation, Saddam Hussein, and the whole 9/11 era, Kim Jong-il, who literally thinks and perpetuates that he is, in fact, a god. Anymore, as tech has taken over and society is encouraged more and more to worship at the altar of science, where doctors and scientists are now the modern gods giving life and doling out death as they see fit, it's not enough for them to simply have statues or inanimate objects to present as idols to their accomplishments or abominations in science, but to actually take what has already been fearfully and wonderfully made and alter it just enough, a small tweak to this DNA strand, this genetic sequence, to finally be able to claim a human being as their own creation because they altered its original genetic makeup and are now able to slap a patent on it. Now you're owned and property of Pfizer or Moderna and whatever shot you were convinced to take a few years ago. Hey, got some writers out today. Got a third one, even though it's not too sunny today, but they don't look like the weekend warrior type either. But getting back to what I was saying, you know, throughout history there have been many, going back once again to ancient times, where a very powerful and revered leader, either through brilliance or brutality, have attempted to conquer various peoples, tribes, cultures, to conquer the world and rule it as though they were God. Many times setting themselves up to be seen and thought of as a divine ruler or a literal deity on earth. Whether it was Genghis Khan building his Mongol empire across Asia and into Europe, arguably the largest empire in history to ever be formed, or Alexander the Great and his empire that stretched from Greece through Egypt to the edges of India, or even Julius Caesar, whose Roman Republic was expanded from Italy all up through Europe, Germania, and Britannia, before being halted and having to then build Hadrian's Wall. There's always one man who wants to subjugate and be worshipped by the people they conquer or rule. How's it going? Not that you can hear me. Kawasaki. You know, I haven't ridden Kawasaki before. When I took the MSF course, they had a couple of smaller bikes that were Kawasaki's, I think, but I chose a Suzuki Boulevard because it looked more of like the cruiser class type bike. I think it was a 250cc. But since then, I think that they've actually upped the CCs with the newer Rebels that came out, like the 3 and 500, a few years ago. Take care. So, as I was saying earlier, you know, there's a phrase that I'm reminded of that applies very well to not only these past instances, but also to what we're actually going through in present history, and that is absolute power corrupts absolutely. We've moved from a time where control over a people was shown through outwardly physical abuse, brutality, and executions, and moved toward control through inwardly psychological and genetically modified behavior. We see this currently even in the school systems, where children that are merely being children are shot up with drugs to help regulate the simple act of being a child in an environment where they are being trained to be workers that don't think, don't talk, don't ask questions, just sit in a numbed state and exist. We see this in the workplaces, where management just want people who will sit and do meaningless task after meaningless task because somehow it improves the company's numbers or increases profits, though employees never see any of that return for the work that they do, though they sacrifice their physical state, their mental state, their emotional state. And who gets the leftovers at the end of the day? Those that actually do care about them at home. As it becomes more and more clear, the politicians really don't run the government, but corporations and CEOs do, such as Gates, Musk, Cook, Fink, just to name a few. It's only natural that the product that they produce would be used somehow in the way they go about controlling not just current generations, but also setting up the control systems for future generations. This may be through an implant chip surgically installed into our bodies, removing our autonomy, having nanotech sprayed onto our foods, or worse, supposed vaccines by Gates straight from his little farm of horrors to your family's table. The methods by which people are controlled have definitely changed drastically over the years. Once, it was controlled by the sword, and in many underdeveloped countries it still is. Then it was controlled by propaganda, as was seen during World War I and II. And now society has become more aware, through the same tech designed to control us through propagandized social media. The powers that be have determined that it's, once again, time to change the way humans are controlled, and they are taking a more internal approach than external. The tools have changed, but the impulse has definitely not. I'm surprised they haven't started developing these stretches of road yet, but give it a few years and no doubt it'll start. But getting back to what I was saying, every time the news talks about some new breakthrough in science, whether it's scientists have unlocked the secret to replicating DNA and have cloned the first ever live mammal, a sheep named Dolly, or with the rising cost of beef, scientists believe they have discovered an alternative worth taking a second look at, 3D printed meat, or an article where honey made without bees using plant sugars and enzymes, and let's not forget McDonald's latest disgusting idea, a plant-based burger they call, yes you guessed it, the McPlant. I'm sure the brilliant minds in the marketing department stayed up all night pulling that idea out of somewhere no one would venture. CRISPR is another one. No, it's not a food, but rather stands for, let me see if I can remember this. It was a long drawn-out scientific name they have for it. It was like clustered, regularly interspaced, short, palindromic repeats. Don't quote me on that. I encourage you to look that one up for yourself. That is a bigger mouthful than a bite out of a McPlant. But this procedure or method is currently being applauded in Japan for having deleted the extra chromosome that is responsible for Down syndrome. Now, of course, you might say, what do you have against people with Down syndrome? Or why wouldn't you want them to remove something that would allow someone to be quote-unquote normal? First of all, what is normal? Half the people in Washington would consider themselves normal, and yet they are some of the most hated in this country. Normality is something that the powers that be have created as yet another tool of division. So, in the case that they decide to alter an infant's genetic makeup passed on from their mother and father, who's to say that they don't remove something that will take away something special that that person might do, or who they might or would become, or what they would accomplish later on in their life? Our success as individuals and what we do in life is not by accident. It's formed by how we were made, because there is purpose behind it. But we as humans have a very, very unhealthy obsession with perfection, but based on whose standards? What would have happened to so many brilliant mathematicians, musicians, artists, and so on if some narcissistic scientist with a god complex went poking around in their DNA and took away the very gift they would end up sharing with the world? The control and the manufacturing of people is ultimately the end game. But even Bill Gates knows you can't just force people into submission. You have to sell them on dependence and slavery first. He's already done it in many third world countries. The largest owner of farmland, and yet he thinks that cattle and beef ought to be done away with and replaced with what? 3D printed and lab-grown meat? But do you even know what that's actually made of? Essentially, it's made up of muscle stem cells that essentially grow like a tumor. Since it's been taken from the biological source, chemicals are added for its growth. No one knows the long-term effects of ingesting and introducing such contaminants to your own bloodstream. Surprisingly, it doesn't just stop at beef. We've also grown fake chicken as well. You know, his reasoning, once again, goes back to the argument of climate change, but once again, it's never about bettering the environment. It is about replacing it with something that he can patent and therefore own, because, by law, no one can claim ownership over something found naturally in nature. Now, of course, due to this fact, ownership of people is slowly becoming a very gray area, much like copyright laws when it comes to logos and the latest AI craze. In most cases, if you change a small piece of an original work, technically, it's not what the original designer had created, but it is now altered and is considered a brand new design. This is the same loophole that people like Gates have been betting on as a workaround. If he can alter the genetics that were originally designed with just enough for courts to consider us a different product than our original created state or version of ourselves, then at that moment we become a patentable asset, property, something that can be owned because we have his technology inside of us. And considering his view on altering plant genetics, produce, meat, anything he can chemically, slightly, butter out of carbon, or digitally alter as a living organism that naturally occurs in nature, it's such that he can then patent it and own it. We, along with everything else, would become essentially digital livestock. You know, just recently, if you think about it, this goes for mRNA tech as well, that was touted and put into these COVID shots. The COVID shots were never about solving a disease. It was never about preventing or curing an illness. The illness is what drove people toward the shots. The spike protein that we hear so much about being able to alter and reprogram our DNA and affect our natural functioning immune system. Now, of course, many still think, oh, that's a conspiracy theory, but they're still the only ones wearing a mask in public spaces. Even Robert Malone, the guy who developed mRNA in the first place, has talked about his concerns in numerous interviews, many hidden from public view, and the implications that it could and will most likely have. Every scientific discovery that is brought to the public's attention is marketed and promoted for either the benefit of their health or the environment, but the truth is, it benefits neither. Nature doesn't charge you for chopping down a tree or taking a drink of water or planting a tomato in the ground. You know, what's interesting is how when they bring out some new alteration to the public, everyone is so excited about the promoted and marketed potential that no one ever asks, we know that's interesting, but where did this actually come from? What is it made from? What are the consequences of its development? What is the consequence of its use? And of course, no, because when sex doesn't sell, an overabundance of hope is all that they've got left. You know, when Dolly, the sheep, not the singer, first came out in the 90s as the first successfully cloned living animal, I think that they probably expected it to be received with greater applause than what it actually did. Because after that initial introduction, it kind of just faded away into nothing. It was just kind of like, you know, Homer Simpson, you know, shrinking back into the bushes. However, like with many experiments, they never truly stop. They just go underground and continue in their development till such a time that the population has either forgotten or society has stooped to yet another level where these types of experiments become more widely acceptable. So much road construction. Seriously, it's never ending. So my turn is supposed to be up here, but I don't know if these cones are for... great. Both lanes closed. What a surprise. Okay, so hopefully this will reroute me, but how far out? Okay. to the next, I guess. Anyway, back to what I was saying. Of course, once again, Hollywood tries to do its part to soften the people's perception to these ideas. They've made movies like The Sixth Day with Arnold Schwarzenegger, which specifically uses human cloning as a central idea to the storyline. Or The Island with Scarlett Johansson and Ewan McGregor, where clones are made as an insurance policy for the rich and the elite of the world in order to have spare body parts and organs when their reckless lifestyles catch up with them. And of course, there are some, comedic takes where they try to show how cloning can improve one's life by essentially making more of you in order to give you, that is the real you, more free time for the things in life that you love. Of course, even in that movie, the clones got tired of just being a copy of a copy and wanted to have their own lives. That's Multiplicity I'm talking about. If you haven't seen that before, it is actually quite humorous. It's got Michael Keaton playing all versions of himself. Most information we're ever given, whether through written documents, movies, the entertainment news, because that's all the news is anymore, if even that. And let's not forget music as well. These are not necessarily warnings, though they should be, and how they usually don't end very well, but it's all conditioning. Get you aware early of what's to come so that when they do roll it out for real, it's not such a big moral shock, and it's easier to stay the public's concerns. The clinical term for this would actually be called exposure therapy. Psychological treatment usually to help people overcome their fears or their phobias. We've actually seen a lot of this during the last 5 to 10 years with Drag Queen Story Hour, the Pride Parades, all of these things that young children have been exposed to as normal behaviors to be accepted and not question the dangers of that or the long-term effects or consequences of that. And honestly, that was just a preview of what they actually had in mind, but couldn't really unleash it fully without buy-in, use a marketing term. But going back to nature, when the host rejects the parasite, it has to go back and regroup and just lay in wait. So I'm guessing that this has me crossing over at this lake bridge down here. I've never actually gone down this road before, but I have wanted to explore this area. It always seemed kind of interesting. You can always tell the man-made lakes around this area because they never cleared out the trees before actually filling it up. It's not exactly the most boating-friendly area. And some of these lakes actually have alligators in them, or at least that's what's been reported before. Further east, you actually have more alligators and even wild boars. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Now, as mentioned before, these Japanese scientists that have figured out how to genetically remove chromosomes now will most likely not just stop at Down syndrome, which, once again, on the surface does not sound like a bad thing. It sounds like it would be the answer to many people's prayers. And of course, that's coming from people most of the time who don't have someone like that in their life currently. What you see more often than not is that those who do have somebody like that in their life, a family member, a brother, a sister, an aunt or an uncle, have a greater understanding of compassion, of true love towards somebody, and acceptance of those who are different because of how unique that experience is for everybody involved. I don't see very many stories where people who have a sibling or a relative and extended families, immediate families, that don't value that person and love them just the same as what society considers as normal. The bigger question that I have is, what gives man the right to decide what genes are worth keeping and which ones are deemed lesser than? To me, it sounds like that is opening the door to eugenics once again, just on a different side of the building. Similar to back when the test tube and designer babies were introduced. You really didn't hear that much about that in recent years, unless once again, that's CRISPR just rebranded. just recently, I saw in the news where they were actually talking about doing that again. And once again, they are trying to do it in order to give the future generation children an edge and their parents to weed out all of the things that could possibly present limitations in that child's life before that child is even born. This is a nice little area back here. I enjoy riding on these type of roads, even though they're not the smoothest than what road in this state actually is. But it's very calm, there's hardly any traffic. You can just kind of enjoy the ride itself, especially whenever it's cooler and there's a nice breeze. It's really nice. Some of these houses back here kind of remind me of beach type houses. They're very simple. They're very minimalist in their landscaping and such. Okay, let's see where this takes me. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Now, expanding that out further, from just the laboratory, where just about every service we use today is subscription-based, from your food to your entertainment, and of course, we can never forget software and music. When and where will that end? Now, can you imagine, while it's still possible just to imagine, the various parts of your own body, or even your body itself? You know, we're sorry, but due to insufficient funds, your liver will be moved offline until full payment can be made. You have no control over this because you were convinced to sign a paper to undergo an experimental treatment that would give you your life back, only to take it away whenever you fail to pay. You're renting your music, your movies, your vehicle, your house. Why wouldn't you be convinced to rent your liver, kidneys, lungs, heart even? You would definitely see corporations and government really pushing for everyone to be an organ donor then, if the option was even still there and it had not become mandatory. Unless the corporocrats view their creation as far superior than anything biologically formed in the womb, and since most corporations donate to politicians both federal and local, you might just get that notice by court order in the mail, because we all know the legal system is still living in the very distant past. So, do I go left or do I go right? They both seem to go to the same road, so it probably doesn't really make much of a difference. But getting back to what I was saying, you know, a chaotician by the name of Dr. Ian Malcolm once stated to John Hammond, "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should." You know, another notable quote from a non-fiction individual would be Robert Oppenheimer upon the creation of the atomic bomb. You know, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." And even more in line with what I've been ranting about would be a quote by Richard Feynman, who said, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." You know, it's interesting that only after these brilliant minds have created an atrocity do they actually realize the long-lasting damage they have done to humanity. That's quite a legacy to leave behind. You know, I mentioned the phrase before, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the thing about playing God is it's never just about power. It's about having the power to remove whatever offends them, even if that happens to be you, taking away your choice, your freedom, your unique existence. If history has taught us anything, everything that is sold to people as a convenience oftentimes ends up in control. You'll have nothing and you'll be happy. Not even control over your own body's autonomy. The body is perfectly designed to handle whatever organisms, viruses, bacteria naturally found in nature. It's when these corporocrats and intellectuals decide to improve the state of humanity that people end up becoming the basis for crimes against humanity and mutated so many men's, women's, and children's genetic makeup are just wiped away. You know, gone are the days when radioactive material was the only thing people had to worry about when it came to genetic alterations or any kind of ungodly mutations. But that's a rant for another ride.